There is a story told in Hong Kong and later in San Francisco that most people who witnessed it never fully described. Not because they had nothing to say, because they weren't sure anyone would believe them. A man walked into a room where the strongest fighter in the district had never lost. He left that room the same way he entered it, quietly. What happened in between, in less than 40 seconds, is the reason certain men, decades later, still lower their voices when they say his name. This is not a story about speed. It is not a story about strength. It is a story about what happens when a man who has nothing left to prove walks into a room full of men who have everything to prove. And what it costs them. There are cities within cities, not on any map, not governed by any law that a courthouse would recognize, but governed nonetheless by older arrangements, by the kind of authority that does not require paperwork or uniform. Only history, only the slow accumulation of who has stood in a particular place and who has walked out of it still standing. Hong Kong in the early 1960s was, on its surface, a city in transition. Commerce moved through its ports. New buildings interrupted old skylines. A certain kind of progress was visible, measurable, photographable, but underneath that surface, in the back rooms of certain establishments, in warehouses that changed function depending on the night, in spaces that had no official name and accepted no outside inquiry, a different economy operated, not of money, primarily, of standing. The underground fighting circuit that existed in pockets of Hong Kong during this period was not organized in the way that Western audiences might imagine. There were no brackets posted on walls, no referees in striped shirts, no entrance fees collected at a formal door. What existed was something older and less structured, a loose network of men who understood, through shared silence and mutual recognition, that certain disputes were settled in certain places by certain means. And everyone in that network understood who was at the top of it. He was not famous in any public sense. His name did not appear in newspapers. He gave no interviews. What he had, instead, was something that in that particular world carried more weight than any published record. He had never lost. Not in that room. Not in any room connected to that room. Not in the memory of anyone who moved through those circles. Witnesses who later spoke of him did not describe a man given to performance or declaration. He did not need those things. Men who have genuinely never lost in their environment rarely do. They carry their record not in their words, but in the way a room adjusts when they enter it. The way conversations shift register. The way younger men position themselves, not behind him exactly, but never directly in front. This was the ecosystem. It had its own etiquette, its own memory, its own sense of what was possible and what was not. And like all closed ecosystems, it had developed a particular intolerance for anything that had not grown inside it. Outsiders were not forbidden. Precisely. They were simply made to understand, through atmosphere alone, that they were guests in a room that had existed long before them and would continue long after. What this room had never encountered, what it was not, in any way, structurally prepared for, was a man who walked into it and felt nothing in particular about it, not contempt, not nervousness, not the careful, calibrated respect that newcomers typically performed. Simply nothing. Bruce Lee, in this period of his life, was known in fragments to the people who occupied these circles. A young man from a film family, trained in Wing Chun under a master whose name carried its own weight, seen on a corner in a school, moving in ways that serious men noted quietly and filed away without comment. He was not unknown, but he was not, in the language of that room, established. And in a world where establishment meant everything, where the entire structure rested on a clear understanding of who deferred to whom, an unestablished man who did not seem troubled by his own unestablishment was not merely an anomaly. He was, without intending to be, a disruption. The room would respond to that disruption in the only language it knew. It would issue a test. There is a particular kind of mistake that intelligent people make. It is not the mistake of ignorance. Ignorance is forgivable. It simply means information was absent. The mistake made in that room, by the men who occupied it, was something more specific, more costly. They looked at Bruce Lee and saw only the parts of him that were visible. And the visible parts, to men who measured everything through the lens of that particular world, did not add up to a threat. He was lean in a way that read as slight. He moved without the deliberate heaviness that many fighters in that circuit cultivated, that physical announcement of mass and intention that served as a kind of pre-fight communication. He did not take up space aggressively. He did not scan the room with the particular calculation that dangerous men often cannot help but perform when they enter unfamiliar territory. He simply entered, and in a room full of men who had spent years learning to read other men, that ordinariness read as limitation. What they could not see, what no one in that room had been given reason to see yet, was the architecture beneath the surface. The years that had gone into what looked like ease, the training that had been so thoroughly absorbed that it no longer announced itself in posture or expression or the set of a jaw. Bruce Lee had begun his formal study of Wing Chun as an adolescent under Ip Man, a master whose approach to the art was rooted not in spectacle but in economy, in the principle that the shortest distance between 2 points was not merely a geometric fact but a fighting philosophy. That wasted movement was not just inefficient, it was a kind of dishonesty, a gap between what you were and what you were pretending to be. That teaching had gone in deep, but the men in that room did not know Ip Man's school in the way they would have needed to know it to understand what they were looking at. And even if they had known the name, knowledge of a system means very little until you have seen what a particular student has made of it. Systems do not fight, people do, and what Bruce Lee had made of his training was not visible in the way that made men in rooms like that one take instinctive note. There were also the years of movement study that existed alongside the formal martial training, an awareness of the body not as a collection of techniques, but as a single instrument, responsive, adaptive, capable of changing its nature depending on what the moment required. This was not something he spoke about in that setting. He had not come to that room to explain himself. He had, by most accounts of those who knew him in this period, come simply because the room existed, and because certain confrontations, in certain worlds, cannot be indefinitely avoided by men who are serious about what they do. He knew what the room was. He knew what the room would eventually require of him. What he did not do, and this is the detail that witnesses return to repeatedly, years later, when they tried to describe him as he was in those early moments, was show any sign of preparation for it, no visible settling of focus, no quiet inventory of the space and its exits, no adjustment of weight or breath that a trained observer would recognize as a man readying himself. He stood in that room the way a man stands in a room he has already left, present in body, somewhere else entirely in mind. And the men who would soon underestimate him watched him stand that way and saw only absence. They did not yet understand that what they were seeing was completion. There is a difference between a challenge and a ceremony. A challenge carries genuine uncertainty. It is issued by a man who does not know the outcome and is prepared, however reluctantly, for either result. A ceremony is something else entirely. It is a performance whose conclusion has already been determined by everyone in the room, including, and most especially, the man performing it. What the underground champion issued that evening was a ceremony. The witnesses who later described it were consistent on this point. He did not approach Bruce Lee with aggression. He did not raise his voice. He did not make the kind of direct, physical provocation that would have read as desperation. He was too experienced for that, too aware of the room and what the room expected from a man of his standing. What he did was quieter, and in its quietness, considerably more calculated. He spoke in the presence of others, which was the point. Not to Bruce Lee privately in a corner, in the way that men sometimes resolve these things without an audience. He spoke where he could be heard, where the words, once released, became property of the room rather than property of the conversation, where refusal would carry a cost that extended far beyond the moment of refusal itself. The substance of what he said has been reported differently by different witnesses. The specific words are less important than their structure. The structure was this: he named Bruce Lee's background. He named his own record. And then he extended what was framed as an invitation but was understood by everyone present as a declaration, "Come and try," 3 words, or their equivalent. Delivered without heat. Delivered, in fact, with a kind of generous patience that was its own form of contempt. The patience of a man who already knows the shape of what is about to happen and is simply waiting for the formality of its unfolding. The room received this in silence, which was its own form of response, because silence, in rooms like that one, is not neutral, it is participatory. It is the audience confirming that yes, they heard, and yes, they are witness, and yes, whatever follows now carries the full weight of what was said in front of them. Silence in that room was a contract, and Bruce Lee understood contracts. What the champion had constructed, with considerable skill, it should be noted, was a situation with no acceptable exit. Refusal meant a particular kind of social death in that world, not a dramatic death, a quiet one. The slow reclassification of a man from someone serious to someone who had, when the moment arrived, shown the room what he was actually made of. It would follow him. Not loudly, but permanently. Acceptance, on the other hand, meant walking into a confrontation on ground that had been entirely chosen and prepared by someone else, in front of witnesses who already believed they knew the outcome, against a man whose entire reputation rested on the fact that no one in that room had ever given him a difficult evening. This was the architecture of the moment, and Bruce Lee stood inside it the same way he had stood inside the room when he first entered. Without visible adjustment, the witnesses noted this. Several of them, speaking years later, said that this was the moment, not the encounter itself, but this moment, the moment of reception, that first introduced a small, unexamined uncertainty into the room. Not fear. Nothing so definite as that, simply a question, unspoken, that no one had expected to find themselves asking. The champion had done everything correctly. So why did it feel, to certain men in that room, like he had just made a mistake? There are moments that witnesses struggle to describe, not because nothing happened, but because what happened moved faster than the language available to contain it. This was one of those moments. The accounts that exist of what occurred in that room vary in their peripheral details, where exactly people were standing, how many were present, what the light was doing. Memory is not a recording device. It is a reconstruction, and reconstructions, built from the materials of shock and attention and the particular angle from which each person was watching, will always differ at the edges. But the center holds. Every witness, across every account, agreed on the same essential architecture of those 40 seconds. And it is in that agreement, in the stubborn consistency of what multiple people, with no reason to coordinate their stories, independently recalled, that the truth of the evening lies. The champion moved first. This detail matters. It was not a lunge, not an explosion of aggression that might have suggested anxiety or miscalculation. It was a controlled, experienced opening, the kind of movement that had, presumably, initiated every successful engagement he had ever fought in that room. Measured, deliberate. The movement of a man who had done this before and knew precisely what it was designed to produce. What it produced, on this occasion, was different. Bruce Lee did not step back. He did not absorb or deflect in any way that suggested he was responding to the champion's initiative. What he did, and witnesses used variations of the same description, without apparent coordination, was arrive. That was the word several of them reached for independently. Not move, not counter, arrive. As though the position he needed to occupy had been determined before the champion had finished deciding to move, and Bruce Lee had simply gone there. Without announcement. Without the visible translation between intention and execution that most fighters, even skilled ones, carry in their bodies like a slight grammatical hesitation before a sentence. There was no hesitation. The champion, by all accounts, was not a man who had ever been made to feel slow. He had the record, the experience, and the physical capability that had consistently placed him ahead of every opponent he had faced in that room. He was not slow. What he encountered was simply something that made his speed feel, for the first time in his career, like a concept that no longer applied. What followed was not an extended exchange. Witnesses described between 3 and 5 points of contact. Precise, sequential, each one arriving before the previous one had fully registered. Not brutal in the way that word is commonly understood, there was no wildness to it, no accumulation of force for its own sake. It was, in the recollection of one man who was standing close enough to have seen the detail, more like a correction than a fight, as though Bruce Lee was not so much attacking as clarifying something. The champion went down, not slowly, not with the kind of gradual yielding that gives a man time to process his own defeat and adjust his understanding of what is happening to him. He went down in the way that things go down when the structural logic beneath them has been removed, completely, and all at once. There was a moment, witnesses were precise about this, between his landing and the room's response, a gap, a small, suspended interval in which no one spoke and no one moved, and the overhead bulb continued its indifferent humming as though nothing of any significance had occurred beneath it. The champion did not rise immediately, not because he was unconscious. He was not, by most accounts, unconscious. He did not rise because something was happening in him that had never happened before in that room, and it required, apparently, a moment to process. He had lost, not closely, not in a way that could be attributed to a fortunate angle or a momentary lapse in concentration or any of the other architectures that pride constructs to protect itself from clean defeat. He had lost before he understood he was losing, and the room, which had attended hundreds of such evenings, which had seen men defeated in every available manner, which prided itself on having seen everything, had no framework for what it had just witnessed. Bruce Lee stood where he had been standing when it ended. He had not moved far from where he started. There is a version of this story that does not exist. In that version, Bruce Lee stands over the fallen champion, and the room receives him as its new authority. Men step aside, eyes lower. A transfer of power is conducted, wordlessly but completely, in the way that such transfers happen in worlds governed by physical hierarchy. The victor claims what the defeated has lost. The room reorganizes itself around a new center. That version does not exist, because Bruce Lee did not perform it. What he did instead was the thing that confused the witnesses most. Not the 40 seconds, that at least had the familiar shape of a physical event, however unprecedented its content. What came after was stranger, more difficult to categorize, more difficult for some men in that room to absorb. He stepped back, not away from the champion specifically, simply back, to a neutral position, a position that carried no claim. He did not stand over the man on the ground. He did not address the room. He did not allow his eyes to move across the faces, watching him in the particular way that men move their eyes across rooms they have just won. He waited. The witnesses described this waiting in different terms. Some said he looked calm. Some said he looked, impossibly, slightly distracted, as though some part of his attention had already moved on to something the room could not see. One man, whose account surfaces in several later retellings, said that Bruce Lee in that moment looked like someone who had completed a task that had been assigned to him by someone else, and was now simply waiting to be released from the room so he could return to whatever he had actually been doing. The champion rose, slowly, without assistance, which the witnesses noted as its own form of dignity. He rose and he stood, and he and Bruce Lee occupied the same room for a moment in a new configuration, one that everyone present understood had been permanently altered, even if no one was prepared to say so aloud. What passed between them in that moment was not documented. If words were exchanged, no witness reported them with confidence. What was reported, consistently, was the quality of Bruce Lee's expression during whatever passed between them. It was not triumphant. It was not cold, or dismissive, or arranged into the careful neutrality that sometimes functions as a more refined form of contempt. Several witnesses, searching for the right description years later, arrived at the same unexpected word, respectful. Not performed respect, not the social gesture of a man managing a room. Something quieter than that, something that suggested Bruce Lee understood, without needing to announce his understanding, that the man standing across from him had built something real in that world, and that what had just occurred did not erase what had been built. It simply added a new piece of information. This was the detail that disturbed certain men in the room more than the fight itself, because the room knew how to process a winner who claimed his winnings. It had a structure for that, a language, a set of rituals, informal but consistent, through which the new order was acknowledged and installed. It had no structure for a man who won completely and wanted nothing from it. That absence of want was unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things, in closed worlds built on clear hierarchies, do not simply pass through without leaving a mark. They lodge. They raise questions that the existing framework cannot answer. They introduce a new kind of uncertainty, not about who is strongest, but about what strength is actually for. The room had believed, until that evening, that it knew the answer to that question. Bruce Lee had not argued with the answer. He had simply demonstrated, in 40 seconds and the silence that followed, that the room had been asking the wrong question entirely. He left shortly after, without ceremony, without the kind of deliberate exit that would have underlined what had occurred. He moved toward the door with the same quality of motion he had brought through it, unhurried, unannounced, carrying nothing from the room that the room could identify as having been taken. Several men watched him go, and at least one of them, by his own later account, felt something he could not immediately name. It took him some years to find the word. The word was instructed. Legends do not travel the way facts travel. Facts move in straight lines. They are handed from one person to another with the intention of arriving intact. Same shape, same weight, same meaning. Legends move differently. They curve. They absorb the atmosphere of every room they pass through. They collect details that were not originally present and shed details that were. By the time they arrive at any given listener, they have become something slightly different from what they were at the source, and yet. The men who were present in that room, the ones who spoke of it later, in private conversations, in the careful language of people describing something, they are still not entirely sure they have the right words for, told a story whose center never changed, not across years, not across distance, not across the natural drift that memory applies to everything it holds for long enough. The center held, and it is in that unchanged center that the significance of the evening lives, not as a record of physical capability, not as evidence in some argument about fighting systems or martial lineages, but as something rarer and more durable, a demonstration of a complete philosophy, visible for 40 seconds, in a room with no name. In the years that followed, Bruce Lee's public life expanded in ways that the underground circuit could not have anticipated. Films, a school, students who came from different countries and different traditions to sit in front of a man who had developed, from the foundations of his early training and the accumulated pressure of encounters like the one in that room, an approach to movement and combat and, eventually, to living, that defied the existing categories. He called it Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. But the men who had been in that room, when they heard the philosophy described in later years, the rejection of fixed forms, the insistence on directness, the belief that the practitioner must become water, must have no fixed shape, must be capable of filling whatever container the moment provides, recognized something. They had seen it before the name existed. They had seen it in the way he entered a room without announcing himself, in the way he stood without performing stillness, in the way he moved without translating intention into action through the visible grammar that even skilled fighters carry, in the way he won without claiming the winning. The champion, for his part, continued in that world for some time after. He did not disappear. He was not, in the social geography of that circuit, destroyed by what had occurred. Men who had witnessed it did not treat him with contempt. The record of what he had built before that evening remained intact, and the people who knew that world understood, in the way that serious practitioners understand, that being defeated by something you have never encountered and have no framework to process is not the same as being found wanting. He had been found simply at the edge of his map. There is no dishonor in that. What changed was quieter than dishonor. It was a certain quality of authority, the unquestioned, atmospheric authority that had never needed to announce itself because it had never been seriously interrogated. That quality did not return, not completely. not in the way it had existed before an evening in a room with no name, beneath a humming overhead bulb. When a young man had arrived from somewhere outside the map and shown the room that the map was smaller than the room had believed. The room itself continued. These things always continued. Different men, same hierarchy, same economy of standing and deference, and the slow accumulation of who had stood where and remained standing. But certain conversations that had once happened easily in that room began to require more words than before. Certain assumptions that had once passed unexamined began, occasionally, to be examined, not loudly, not in ways that disrupted the surface, underneath, where the real architecture lives. Bruce Lee died in 1973. He was 32 years old. The circumstances of his death have generated more words than most lives generate in their entirety, and those words are not the concern of this story. What is the concern of this story is smaller and more specific. It is the fact that men who had been in that room, some of them quite old by then, some of them long removed from the world that room had represented, heard the news and felt something that surprised them by its weight. Not grief, exactly, or not only grief. Something more like the feeling of having been given something years ago that you only now, in the moment of its permanent absence, fully understand the value of. One man, speaking privately, said this: he didn't come into that room to teach us anything. He came in because the room was there and the situation required it. But he taught us anyway, not with words, not even with what he did, with what he didn't do after. He left without taking anything. That's what none of us could understand at the time. That's what I've spent 30 years understanding. The overhead bulb in that room has long since gone dark. The room itself, in whatever warehouse or back corridor it occupied, has been something else for decades, storage, perhaps, or simply empty, the city having moved on and rearranged itself above it without ceremony or acknowledgement. But the story remains, not because it has been carefully preserved, not because someone thought to write it down while the witnesses were still present and the details were still fresh. It remains because certain things, once seen, cannot be unfiled, because a room full of men who believed they had seen everything encountered, on one unremarkable evening, something they had not seen before, and because the man who showed it to them walked out of the room and back into the city and did not look back. He had somewhere else to be. He always had somewhere else to be.